John chapter 12 this morning, if you would turn to it, loving Jesus above all else. Now, not like the story about in the 1990s during the riots in Los Angeles, a radio reporter broadcast an interview he'd had with one of the looters. And the man had just stepped out of a record store carrying a number of, a music store, record store, and carrying a number of cassette tapes in those days that he decided he wanted. And when asked what he had stolen, he said, "Gospel tapes, I love Jesus." Not that kind. John chapter 12, the first 8 verses. Verse 1, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Loving Jesus above everything else. Those who are pastors here probably have had many times this experience where you feel like when you go to preach a sermon, this has to be the most important thing that was ever said. Like, there is nothing more basic than this. Well, that's what it feels like, talking about this issue, loving Jesus above all else. The story is told of a shabby old gentleman who at 12 o'clock every day would enter the local church and stay a few minutes, and then he would leave. The caretaker was concerned for the altar furnishings, and every day he watched to make sure that nothing was taken, but every day, right at noon, this shabby figure would arrive through the door. And one day the caretaker accosted him and said, "Look here, my friend, what are you up to coming into the church every day?" He says, "I go to pray," he says politely. "Now, come on," he said, "you don't stay long enough to pray." He said, "Well, true enough, I cannot pray a long prayer, but every day I just come and say, 'Jesus, it's Jim.' And then I wait a minute and I come away. I guess he hears me, even though it's not a long prayer." And then one day, Jim was knocked down crossing the street, and he was laid up in the hospital with a broken leg. And the ward where Jim was a sore spot to the nurses on duty, while he just happily lay there. Some of the men on that ward were cross and miserable. Others did nothing but grumble in from morning till evening. It was so hard, sometimes it would make the nurses cry. Slowly but surely the men stopped their grumbling and became cheerful and contented. And one day as the nurse was walking through the ward, she heard the men laughing, and she said, "What happened to all of you? You're such a cheerful lot of patients lately." They said, it's old Jim. He's always cheerful, never complaining, although he is uncomfortable and in pain." And so the nurse walked over to Jim's bed where the silvery-haired Jim was with an angelic look on his face and said, "Jim, well, these men say you're the cause of the change in the ward. They say you're always happy." He says, "Hey, that I am, nurse. I can't help it. You see, nurse, it's my visitor. He makes me happy. She's a visitor? She was puzzled, for she'd never noticed any visitor coming to Jim's bed. He didn't have any friends, family. The chair was always empty during visiting hours because nobody came in. He says, when does your visitor come? Every day. With light in his eyes, growing brighter, he said, yep, every day at 12 o'clock he comes and stands at the foot of my bed. I see him there, and he smiles at me, and he says, Jim, it's Jesus. Now, that story may be a little over-dramatized, may be very true, but it may sound trite. But I will say this, there are still people in the world, and have always been since the dawn of the church, those who live with just that kind of relationship with Jesus. They don't complicate anything, they don't add anything, they don't take anything away. They just simply love Jesus with all of their hearts, and they put nobody nor nothing before him. And when we hear those stories and we read about them, we aspire to be like them, or we ought to. But the good news is we can all live with the same love for Jesus that Jim had. It is not wishful thinking. It can be the place where every last one of us lives, and I hope this morning, this day, we put the wheels in motion to make that happen. I don't know about you, but I hunger and thirst to simply love Jesus, to think like him and for him, to speak like him and for him, to act like him and for him. You see, there are a lot of Christians who seem to like Jesus. They admire Jesus, but they don't love him above all else. And here's what I mean. See, I can love theology books, Christian books. I can love reading and writing, but do I love Jesus above all else? I mean, I can love singing hymns and worship songs and music and love the tunes and so on, but do I love Jesus more than that? I can say I love being involved in being part of a denomination and a fellowship, but do I love Jesus more than the PAOC or the PAON or the AG or any other denomination? I can say I love being involved in church programs and community work, but do I love Jesus first and foremost above all of that and above everything else? Because the question that's always been before us from the time of Jesus to this day from the New Testament is, would I lay down my life for him? That is to say, my hopes and my dreams and my finances and my successes and even my physical life if I was called upon to do so. If you remember the words of Jesus to the church at Ephesus in the book of Revelation, it's interesting. He commends them for their hard work and their good deeds and their perseverance and all that kind of thing. But then he says, yet, verse 4 of chapter 2, yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Now think about that. Think about that. They had hard workers, doing good deeds, persisting, really standing up to persecution, but you lost your first love. The message to them, to the church at Ephesus, was not about how much activity was going on in their church, how many agencies they had for this and that, how good the leaders were. It was a message to the whole church, and it wasn't pretty. They'd lost the fire of their first love. It had burned low. Remember when you were first saved? You couldn't get enough of Jesus. You wanted to study the Word. You wanted to pray. You wanted to sing. You wanted to tell everybody what happened to you, that you got saved. You were willing to do anything, say anything, go anywhere because of the joy in your soul, because of the freedom you felt from the past. But as the years wore on, you settled back and you contented yourself with the status quo. And like the frog in the kettle, you slowly became a spectator. Like a hockey fan watching a game and analyzing or criticizing. Very fine line between those two, as you know. Everything happening on the ice. Giving the color commentary on what the first line should have done to prevent that goal or score another goal. That is the question. Do we still love Jesus above everything else? Do we still love Jesus with all of our souls and hearts and minds? He ought to be the first thought when we awaken and the last when we go to sleep. We ought to see ourselves as His followers glued to Him, bonded to Him. Scientists tell us there's a special protein in the body that holds the cells together. It's called laminin. It's a silidesian protein, like a superglue. It keeps our cells together. And they tell us that without that protein, our skin wouldn't even stay together. It wouldn't go over our muscles and our bones. Our cells wouldn't connect. Our love for God, for Jesus, must be just like laminin, something that bonds us to Him. You say, Pastor, that's weird talk. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is, folks. We sing that song, old song, there is a name I love to hear, I love to sing its worth. It sounds like music in my ear, the sweetest name on earth. Oh, how I love Jesus. Loving Jesus, first of all, is gratitude. We must get back again to extravagant, reckless love for Jesus. Tim was a businessman. After being away on business, he thought it would be nice to bring his wife a little gift. And so he went into the store and he asked the cosmetics clerk, he said, how about some perfume? And she showed him a bottle costing $50. So that's a bit much. So he went back, she returned with a smaller bottle for $30. He said, that's quite a bit. So she was getting more annoyed and she brought her the tiny $15 bottle. He said, what I mean is, I'd like to see something really cheap. And so she handed him a mirror. Smart lady. Hope I got some brownie points on that one. And Mary, in this story, had developed such a love for Jesus. Before this incident ever takes place, she had developed a love for Jesus, her Lord, even though, you remember, he didn't show up when she thought he should and so prevent her brother Lazarus from dying. She still loved him, and she wanted to show it in the best way she could. But before we come back to that story, I'm going to come back to that one toward the end. Luke has another story about a similar instance, something like it. In that story, in Luke chapter 7, Jesus is invited to the home of a Pharisee for a party. Now, in those days, parties were public events. And in homes where those not invited, they're often held in an outdoor court kind of thing, and often those who weren't invited could stand around and watch what was happening, analyzing the show. And the way it was set up, and other history will tell us this, there was a single table in the middle, something like we would have like a center table in a room, but they had couches around three sides. The fourth side was for the servers, but there were couches all around the other three sides, two on the sides and one couch on one end. And people would kind of lay reclining against those couches with their feet up and their heads close to the table. So Jesus was reclining like that in the house of Simon. And suddenly, unannounced in the story Luke tells us, a woman, likely not a guest, but someone in the crowd looking on, steps forward. And she's crying. Luke tells us that that she's a sinner, which very likely means that she had been an adulteress. And she came with an alabaster jar of ointment, and with tears streaming down her face. It doesn't say that she said a word. She seemingly doesn't say anything. She just walks up behind Jesus at the table. And she lets her tears fall on his feet, and and the tears kind of wash away the dust that's gathered from the road, and she wipes them with her hair. Now, in those days, some writers tell us that in those days, if a woman unbound her hair and let her hair fall down, it was a dead giveaway as to who she was and what her profession was. But that's what she does. She kisses his feet, and then she puts this expensive ointment on the feet after she's wiped them. Now, you can imagine, this is the home of a Pharisee. You can imagine what those standing around were thinking. Simon, the homeowner, is saying to himself, what is Jesus, the teacher, thinking? He should not be letting this happen. If he was really a prophet, he'd know who this woman was. Now, in that story, it looks like the only reason Jesus got invited to this party was out of curiosity from Simon. He just want to see what Jesus had to say. He obviously wasn't treated like an equal, because you notice something. If you read that story in chapter 7, they didn't even offer him the usual amenities like putting oil on his head, which they did in those days, and washing his feet. They didn't do any of that. That would be as bad as if you invited some guest into your home, a person you didn't know very well, and you didn't show them where the washroom was, and you didn't ask them if they wanted to drink, and so on and so on. As far as Simon is concerned, Jesus has flunked the test. In verse 39, Simon says, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner. And Jesus knows what Simon is thinking, of course. And so he speaks up. He says, Simon, I have something to tell you. And he says, yes, teacher, by all means, tell me, yeah. He says, well, two people owed money to a certain lender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. And Jesus says, exactly. This woman is doing what you did not do. As far as Jesus is concerned, he's not the one who's failed the test. Simon is the one who has failed to see what was really important. Because she had been forgiven much, she felt compelled to pour love, to wash his feet with her tears, dry them with her hair, anoint not only his head but his feet with this expensive ointment. Her sins, which were many, were forgiven because she loved much, Jesus is saying. Now, think about Simon. Simon, Pharisee. Man, he's the church guy. He's the guy who should know it. He knew all about religion. He knew about temple worship. He knew about the law. He knew all about the things of God. She knew nothing about that. But he misses the essence of it all. He was missing, listen, he was missing the relationship that Jim had in that story. That simple openness to Jesus. The woman knew how sinful she was. That's why she was crying. That's why she was weeping. But Simon thought he was better than he was. He had lost. Simon, along with many others of his group, had lost the relationship that God had intended back in the days of Moses. You know, when the Israelites were commanded to love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your mind and with all of your soul and with all of your spirit. You see, when the simplicity of a love relationship with Jesus is lost, all is lost. There is nothing of value left. There is no such thing as true Christianity when it's not there. Church is meaningless. Everything we do is meaningless unless there is the simplicity of that love relationship with Jesus. But when we've been forgiven, when we've received pardon, when we've been released from a life of sin and the guilty conscience that goes with it, when we receive what we know we did not deserve, we love much and we pour out everything. You see, outside of that, I want us to get us to see this, outside of that love relationship with Jesus, everything else is boredom and drudgery. And listen, volunteering to do stuff under a Christian name, unless that love relationship is there. The woman knew that something had happened in her life and she was responding. She was pouring out the best she had to give. The person who knows he or she is sinful, not living up to what they want to. The person who keeps falling and knows that they want a closer love relationship with Jesus is closer to him than the person who thinks he or she is perfectly fine. Thank you very much. Constant repentance and gratitude for forgiveness is the life of love for Jesus. It's the life of fulfillment. Ongoing, day-by-day repentance and thankfulness. There is nothing good enough in us to win God's favor. It's his unconditional love that has been poured out upon us. And the best we could ever do in ourselves to fix our brokenness and heal our souls is less than adequate in his sight. We love him because he loved us first and keeps on loving us. This part of a Southern gospel song that one of the groups sing, there's a line that goes like this: grace will always be greater than sin. Calvary has proven it time and again. Whatever you've done, wherever you've been, God's grace will always be greater than sin. Broken and bruised from the choices you've made. Sin is a price, and so often you've paid. Oh, but Jesus is waiting. Now, new hope is in him, and grace will always be greater than sin. That kid from Stratford, Justin Bieber, he can experience the love of Jesus again. He knows all about it. The biggest problem with people is not the depth of their failure, but their failure to admit, to humble down and confess that without Jesus, they're without peace and without hope. Humility, admitting that we've done wrong, it takes a lot for some people. I mean, I read somewhere where a pastor was given a badge for being humble. They took it away the first time he wore it. Humble down and confess that without Jesus we have no hope. Let's face it, young kid had some Christian roots. But being a celebrity in the entertainment industry and having a sprawling mansion in California and more money than he'll ever know what to do with has brought him a big fat zero as far as eternity's values is concerned. It's not difficult to love Jesus when you know that if it had not been for him, you would be facing a future without God and a lost eternity at the end. It's not difficult to love Jesus. True story. A 9-year-old boy lived in a rural town in Tennessee. His house was in a poor area of the community back several years ago now, when they had buses for Sunday school and church. And they came knocking on his door one Saturday afternoon, the bus pastor. The kid came to answer the door, and he greeted the bus pastor, and the bus pastor asked if his parents were home, and the small boy told him that his parents take off every weekend, leave him at home to take care of his little brother. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and he asked him to repeat it, and the youngster gave the same answer, and the bus pastor asked to come in and talk with him, and they went into the living room, sat down on the old couch. Foam and the springs were all exposed. He said to the kid, where do you go to church? And the young boy surprised him by saying, I've never been to church in my whole life. And the bus pastor was struck by the fact, of course, that the church was only just around the corner, just a few kilometers from the child's house. And he said, "Are you sure you've never been to church?" He said, "No, I'm sure I have. I've never been to church." And then the bus pastor said, "Well, son, more important than going to church, have you ever heard the greatest love story ever told?" And then he proceeded to share the gospel with this little 9-year-old boy, and his other little brother was in the room. And the young lad's heart began to be tender. And at the end of the story, the bus pastor asked if the boy wanted to receive this free gift and asked Jesus into his heart. And the boy said, "You bet." And the kid and the bus pastor got on their knees, and the lad invited Jesus into his heart and received the Lord. They both stood up, and then the bus pastor said, "Well, could I pick you up for church tomorrow morning?" He said, Sure. So the bus pastor got to the house the very next morning early and found the lights off, and he let himself in, and he weaved his way through the house and found the little boy asleep in his bed. And he woke him up and his brother and helped get them dressed. And they got on the bus and gave him a donut and for his breakfast on the way to church. And remember, this boy had never been in church before. The church was a large church. Little kids sat there, clueless what was going on, had no idea anything was happening. A few minutes into the service, these tall, unhappy guys walked down to the front and picked up some wooden plates. One of the men prayed, and the kid, with absolute fascination, watched them walk up and down the aisles. He still no idea what was going on. And all of a sudden, like a bolt of lightning, it hit him what was taking place. These people were actually giving money to Jesus. And he reflected on the free gift of life that was explained to him less than 24 hours earlier. He immediately searched his pockets front and back. He knew he had no money, couldn't find a thing to give to Jesus. And by this time, the offering plate was passed down the aisle, and with a broken heart, he just grabbed the plate and held on to it. He finally let it go, and he watched it pass down the aisle, and then his eyes remained glued on the plate. It was passed back and forth all the way to the rear of the sanctuary. Then suddenly he had an idea. Little 9-year-old boy, didn't know any different in front of God and everybody. He got up out of his seat. He walked about 8 rows back, grabbed the usher by the coat tail, and asked to hold the plate one more time. And then he did the most astounding thing you could imagine. He took the plate, he put it on the carpeted floor, and he stepped into the center of it. And as he stood there, he lifted his little head and he said it loudly enough for everybody to hear. "Jesus, I don't have anything to give to you today, but just me. I give you me." That's the story of Jim. That's the story of the woman who poured out all that she had. Loving Jesus calls for nothing less. And I tell you, the burden of my heart for me and for all of us and for my generation and for the generation that's coming behind us is that there is so much Christianity that is gray and vague and blah. It's neither cold nor hot. It's neither in nor out. Where is the intense, extravagant love for Jesus that drives us to be and to say and to do and to go and anywhere and do anything and delight in doing it? Loving Jesus is gratitude. Secondly, and finally, loving Jesus is relationship. Now let's look at the other story. It's just before Passover. We read about it. Jesus is in Bethany, the hometown of Lazarus. It's a very different scene. He was in the home of a Pharisee before. This is a very different scene. He knew these people now. They're friends. They knew him. He had raised Lazarus from the dead, and they're having a dinner for him. If it's the same story that Mark and Luke have, which it likely is, it's in the home of Simon the leper. Martha is serving Jesus. Lazarus is alive and well, sitting at the table there. But now, Mary is the one now who takes this alabaster jar of very expensive perfume worth about a year's wages in that time. She kneels and anoints Jesus' feet and wipes them with her hair. We don't know. She too may have been grateful for forgiveness, but she was the one, remember, she was the one who loved to sit at Jesus' feet. Luke tells us.